starting to see, well, sorry about that. I don't know what that message was. We're starting to see a smaller brain size, and sometimes even a smaller physical body size. That can be, in some research they've shown, to be caused by the brain growth hormone factor that's prominent when a child sleeps. So sleep that is missed out on as an early part is going to affect not only the emotional components, as we know, when a child doesn't get enough sleep, but it's also going to affect their physical development of that brain. Stress also impacts their emotional brain development and their inability to self-regulate and soothe themselves. We start to see developmental concerns, behavioral concerns in these early childs, maybe when they can't soothe and calm down. And then the social and the cognitive, these are two other areas that we see a lot of impact for stress and brain development. Our self-esteem, feeling like they're able to do things, their self-efficacy, their ability to reflect empathy and their perception of themselves and others. So the social components. So interacting, not just with adults, but interacting with their peers, making friends, feeling confident, comfortable, their cognition, their attention, memory, language, their abilities for reasoning, planning, and thinking. And these are all areas that continue to be impacted and continue to grow in development, because a lot of this does happen in that frontal lobe, and that will continue for several years, but the early seeds are planted here. So when we have a brain that's stressed, we have a limbic system that's flaring. Our emotional and social areas are going to be compromised, so therefore the higher learning is not going to be able to get to that top part of the brain as easily as it would with a child who can self-regulate, who can self-soothe themselves. Another thing that I wanted to note here really in particular is that stress doesn't just impact one area, it impairs all areas in brain development. And also noted on here, I put that sensory processing concerns, those and auditory processing concerns are also, I see a lot of that compromised in those early areas due to some kind of stress or trauma that may have occurred in their development. So what does this look like in terms of how it impacts the learning? How are they able to learn based off these structural changes that can occur in the brain when they're impacted by stress? Well, it's going to impair how they learn, how they remember, how they recall information. It's going to impact their attention and their concentration. Young children use their primitive brain areas when they respond to stress. But when we have repeated exposure to this area of the brain, it will cause structural changes in those neural networks and the development of that higher cortex brain. So when your alarm system is going off in the morning or in the afternoon or whenever it is that you're trying to learn as a young child and that alarm system is going off, it's very difficult for you then to hear instruction from someone else if you've got an alarm going off all the time. So it's going to impact what you hear, how you perceive information, and how you process that information. There are a lot of biochemical changes that happen in the body when the body is exposed to high levels of cortisol. It produces changes in glucose and insulin and lots of inflammation. It can compromise the brain derivative neurotrophic factor, which is that growth factor. And it also can compromise neurotransmitter levels. So, that's where we start to see the compromise with the stomach aches, the headaches, things like that in a young child. So physically, their body is kind of in an uproar, but that's changing their brain too. Their decrease in the ability to be flexible and adaptable so that they become more rigid in their thinking. Transition is where we see this often. They don't like to transition back and forth between different environments. That becomes very difficult for them. And then sometimes the more we create that safety net for them to be able to transition, sometimes it can reinforce that pathway. Not always, but sometimes. Stress also impairs our immune system function. These are children that are highly increased risks of infections, colds, illnesses. They're absent a lot from school. Repeated things happen in terms of sickness. And then their susceptibility to long-term developing into more anxiety, depression, and other mental health concerns. There have been some studies on that as well. The increase of the physical demands on the body, just where they are breathing more shallow, and requiring, more oxygen. Sometimes their body temperature goes up, their heart rate. So it's creating more physical demands on the body as well, which can lead to exhaustion at some point. But the awareness, the focus, and the attention are what really we see compromised and what starts to signal big red flags. And that happens when the brain has activated that sympathetic nervous system, because it is going to pay attention to what it needs to fight, flight, or freeze from. And when that happens, that part of the brainstem is activated, and they're not concerned with what's next on the agenda for their day, or what they're supposed to be learning at that moment. They're more focused on, how am I going to get out of the situation? What can I do? They're in that heightened state of panic. So they are not paying attention, which means they're not encoding information, which means they're not going to remember information, which means they're not going to be able to retrieve it later. And finally, on this slide, it talks about the brain really remembers our negative experiences. And sometimes we can see this activate the pain center in the brain. And that's where then maybe a child doesn't want to participate in an activity or do an activity, because that activity then is associated with a negative experience, which then causes them to want to shut down, stop, not continue. And then that, of course, then you're going to have behavioral, emotional, sometimes physical issues, and it becomes very difficult for them at that point to self-regulate. So at that point, we've activated everything wrong that needs to happen, and we're having trouble having control at that point. So we want to try to minimize those in our early learning and note those. This is obviously nowhere near a comprehensive list, but these are some common things that I see in my practice, of things that people come in and tell me that happens in our young learners. Frequent aches and pains, usually that's head and tummy, but it can be other things too. My arm hurts, my finger hurts, things like that, especially a young child. Sometimes they don't have those great verbal skills to pinpoint really what might be hurting them, or maybe it's an attention thing. They're really trying to draw attention that they're needing something from us at that moment. And then some obvious things: soiling the pants, chewing on clothes, fingers, things that aren't appropriate. Sometimes these children, one thing that I note on here that I see commonly is either a lack of appetite or they're always hungry. And again, sometimes that goes back to where stress can activate that pain center, and they're using food as something to help minimize that pain. It also gets them out of doing whatever it is we're wanting them to do. So that's kind of an interesting one, and I am seeing that more and more often in the past couple of years especially. And then the obvious things that we see early are complaints. They come in, they're not attentive, they can't sit still, they're hyperactive, they're impulsive, they can't wait their turn, things like that. I feel like we're probably good at recognizing those signs. Some other things that are starting to be more mainstream, I feel like a lot of schools, a lot of places are becoming more aware to how they can be overstimulated or understimulated by sensory information. Sensory information really impacts a young learner. They're very sensitive, usually to sound and lights, and can be, and I didn't put it on here, but touch. Touch can also be a big sensory point for these children. Sometimes they like to be wrapped up, sometimes they don't want to be touched. So depending on how they're trying to deal with that, we might conclude that it could be something sensory that could be setting them off down a path that isn't helpful. So again, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but kind of gives us some different things that we see in our practice. So what are some of the sources of stress? Well, again, not comprehensive. We could probably list pages and pages here, but and some of these are going to be a lot more difficult to change than others. But these are some of the things that come up commonly. Obviously, we're pretty all familiar with how socioeconomic conditions can impact a child's learning. But there can also be things such as divorced and blended family homes, kids that go back and forth a lot, kids that spend extended time in before care and after care programs, inconsistent care or not being picked up and dropped off on time, not having the supplies and the things they need at school. So those can be stressful for a kid. The bus ride, I didn't put that on there, or transportation to and from activities. Sometimes car rides in general can be a source of stress for children. Some have, I see a lot of kids having trouble with transportation at times. And then there's some things that aren't as obvious that we may not think are contributing to stress, but that can be, and I see commonly, overscheduled kids. Not enough downtime to run and play and be bored. Bored is okay. Bored is good for our brain. We don't have to be constantly entertained all the time. And we find that if we're not doing an activity, then we need to be, doing another activity. So a lot of technology. I see way too much technology in these young learners, and I know a lot of learning is moving to this platform, and that's great, but we need to understand that we also need to be engaging and chatting and talking and storytelling and laughing and playing games with these kiddos. And then just some common things like nutrition, when there's a picky eater or a lack of consistent nutrition or not eating all of their lunch, something could be going on. We need to consider that a source of stress, maybe eating in general. Lots of kids out there with eating difficulties that really are going to impact then how they learn because they're not getting enough protein and glucose, and the brain's going to have a harder time keeping up. And then obviously lack of sleep. So what can we do now that we know some of these things? One of the biggest things that I like to help people do, the parents that I work with these children, are really trying to note what is the trigger. And sometimes I'll have people come in and say, oh, well, I know exactly what the trigger is. It's every time they want to do their homework, or every time they come home in the afternoon, it's school's just too stressful, or whatever they think the trigger is. I really like for them to get a little more specific, noting the time of day, what activities could be causing some of this stress. Is it transitioning? Are we having these triggers? Are we having this outburst, the behavioral things? Are we having these things when we're transitioning from one environment to the next? Another area that I like for people to note is, what are they like when they play, when they can relax, when they can run, when they can, enjoy time with their friends, or their siblings or their neighbors outside? What are they doing? What are they choosing to do or not do? So really, really, really honing in on some of the triggers. And again, that can go back to things like, what's the environment like when they're coming home? Is it chaotic? Is it loud? Is it very busy? Is it boring? Where are we seeing these difficulties, and really starting to note them and log them, so we can start to identify maybe some patterns that we didn't see before, and really dig a little bit deeper into the source of that trigger. So some great questions are, what activities are activating for that child or that cause their behavior to change? What activities or times might be soothing or more pleasant for your child? These are 3 questions that I commonly ask people. And then, what do they enjoy doing? What really makes them laugh and smile and engage with you? And you'd be amazed at some of the answers that I get to these questions, but it really makes you stop and think and really try to identify. So the huge takeaway that I want you to have for today is that brains can regulate other brains in any given situation. And so what that means is, if I am a parent and I am having a really stressful day, and my child comes home and we know he's coming home always stressed out at the end of the day, then we're going to feed off each other. And I know that sounds really simple, but if I have 2 people walk in my office, a child and a parent, and there's obviously some tension between the 2, either they didn't want to quit playing, they didn't want to, they're not going to get to do what they want to do later because of something that happened. My opportunity at that moment, as someone that's trying to help this child, is to help them regulate in the moment. And so my calm, low voice in a very dim lit area where the environment is very conducive to reducing all that sensory input and really sitting down and listening to that child can help that brain regulate to where I am. And so brains regulate each other. And so really understanding the need for that child to be seen, safe, heard, and secure is going to help reduce that stress response so that they're able to come down and really then communicate and let us know what's going on inside. So identify the triggers, keep a journal, keep consistent routines. Positive reinforcement is always something that I try to support for families. Be aware of our environment, making sure that it's sensory friendly if needed. Incorporate brain breaks, giving them time to run and play. Music can be very regulating for a brain. We work off rhythm and movement. These young kiddos need to be moving. That's how they learn. That's how they grow. That's how they develop. Some calming activities I threw in here that you might think about at times if you want to incorporate in a brain break or a time to just kind of chill out in the morning if you're not going to get into mindfulness and yoga, which I love for kiddos, young children especially. Breathing exercises, blowing bubbles, coloring, art, Play-Doh, things like that, really kind of connect back down and get simple, just really calm activities. And again, just the connecting one-on-one and offering that empathy to help regulate that brain. That is what I would say is probably one of the most important things that you can do when you see a child that is just super stressed and having a hard time regulating. And here's a great resource. I don't know, many of you may know this one, but I point parents to this one a lot. Understood.org, they have lots of free webinars and information for lots of different things that you can look up. And I always refer parents there because they do have a lot of great articles and stories and things that might help you, if you feel the need to have them evaluated by someone if you think something else might be going on. But that's a great resource for kiddos and parents. Oh, sorry about that. And then I guess that kind of concludes what I wanted to say today. So I hope that I've just created some more awareness about what what stress looks like in a brain and how it affects how they develop and how they communicate, and it really just impacts their functioning, and we really want them to be regulated for optimal learning. So I think that's all I have for today. So if anybody has any questions, I'll come back on here.
Super. Thank you so much, Kristie. Yes, this is question and answer time, and I can man the chat. And if anybody has questions for Kristie, ideas, things that they've encountered, we would love for you to engage and share with us now. Thank you. You did a great job.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kristie. This was full of very useful information. I'm going to tell my 2 kids that you said being bored is good. How do helicopter parents contribute to their child's stress?
Oh, wow. A lot. Yeah, that's a good one. I see a lot of that. I think that that would definitely be an area. I mean, we feed off each other, right? So if I'm stressed and I'm worried about an assignment or something they didn't do, or they forgot their backpack or their lunchbox, or they're always, that's going to stress out it's going to stress out a child. It's going to make them feel, like a failure, like they didn't do something right, like they've disappointed. And, kids don't want to disappoint. They don't want to fail. They want, parents to be proud of them. So how does it contribute? It's a huge player. It's a huge player. And it can be very difficult to address, and it can be very difficult to stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. I often tell my kids that creative ideas come out of boredom.
Ooh, absolutely. So I have a 15-year-old, and he told me a couple days ago that he was bored. And I said, bored is watching paint dry. That's being bored. But I do agree that when our brain is always fixated and focused on learning, then we kind of shut down some of that creative process. And I'll give you an example. I took a course probably a year or so ago that talked about focused learning. And it talked about when you're trying to solve a problem and you're really focused on trying to figure out ways to analyze this problem, you're activating neural networks that you're just really intense, trying to come up with, well, if I don't do this, I could do this. If I don't do this, I could do this, and really fixated. If you walk away from that and take a break to go be bored, take a walk, bike ride, nap, whatever it is, and you come back to that, later, the answer to that problem will often just reappear. Oh my gosh, it's because your brain went into what's called diffuse mode thinking. So what's great about a brain break is focusing back and forth between those two different modes of thinking, from focused to diffuse mode. And that's where we'll be more creative. That's where we'll solve those problems. So taking a break in the middle of a homework assignment or a middle of a project that's really difficult is really good for your brain, because it allows that brain to break away, be more creative, go to other parts of the brain, other memories that it can access when it's not so focused on trying to hone in on one thing. So boredom is great, and it does allow for more creativity.
Okay. I had a parent that said their child had pica, P-I-C-A, and a doctor never diagnosed. Do you think he could have been eating everything from stress?
Ooh, pica that can be challenging to diagnose, and I would highly recommend that they seek a feeding therapist or clinic for that. But yes, I do find that oral kids will want to put things in their mouth to soothe. And that kind of comes from early development where we suck. And that is soothing for them. And so the brain has to find a way to do that. So some kids will then, they call it either an oral defensiveness or an oral fixation, where they're constantly seeking that input to try to soothe themselves. So obviously, I don't know your child, and I'm not a doctor, but it's very commonly seen that children will want to chew on things or put things in their mouth, especially in times of stress. Little ones in particular, you'll see the finger go in the mouth almost instantaneously if they are in an environment where they're not quite sure how to handle, and they kind of panic, and you see the thumb or the fingers start going in the mouth. They start putting things in there. So absolutely, I believe that could be from stress.
Okay. Another question. How would you go about rewarding students and children?
Frequently and positively. And that could be, I like to use timers, and I like to tell people how to use a timer. And it usually works well for most, not all, but it does usually work well for most if you're consistent with it. So I would do small incremental rewards. It doesn't have to mean, a new toy or a new trip. It can mean 5 extra minutes of something, or positive reinforcement. Gosh, there's so many ways we could do that. It doesn't always have to be, I don't always want people to use food, but it could be something food related, whether it's dessert or whether it's a piece of candy or a piece of gum or something like that. Although I don't like that. I would rather them give them an extra bedtime story, or an extra 5 minutes at bedtime, or get to stay up, or maybe they get to ride their bike for 10 minutes longer. I think you have to figure out what age and stage of development and really what speaks their language. And it might be movement, it might be time with them, it might mean, 5 extra minutes of screen time. But small, frequent rewards are what I would recommend.
And then someone also put in the chat, I would ask students what would motivate them and then build a reward systems based on that. Some students just want free time. We also had someone that said, thank you for the resources. I just looked up the understood.org link, and there's a wealth of information that they're going to use. So perfect.
Yay!
I am currently working with ages 3 to 5. Most students know what motivates them. However, without having to stress over students, what is a great motivation or reward for all?
Ooh, 3 to 5. I would say 3 to 5, engaging in something fun together with them. Normally they're starting into this whole creative play, and they learn so much through that avenue. They've even had studies where the reading is linked to their ability to creative play. So I would say choosing activities to really engage you with them so that you can get to know them on a level where they just feel heard, safe, seen. I guess that would be probably my biggest suggestion for that age.
Okay. Let's see. Somebody wanted to know if you'd be willing to share the PowerPoint.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm going to put your email address right now in the chat, so you can email Kristie. Her email I just put in there. Also, this is recorded, so it will be on the Google site, and you will have her entire PowerPoint also. People are just saying great responses. I'd like the PowerPoint to take back to work. So very positive feedback. This was a very great session. Thank you so much. Does anybody have anything else, or do you have any, may I please have the Google site for future reference? Yes, I'll put it in there. Do you have anything else that you would like to add?
No, just I guess the one thing I would like to say is if you have a child that's struggling, one of the reasons that I chose to go back to school and to go back to really a second career in life was because I really saw the need to connect several fields and really help people understand things. And it's really becomes really helping educate other parents. And that is the bridge between education, psychology, nutrition, and really helping people understand how, in sleep, that's another huge one, how all of that really impacts us as a whole. We can't just look at, a diagnosis or a pill or this or that to fix things. Stress manifests in our lives in every way. And we have to figure out, how to deal with those things. But sometimes it's those little subtle things and those triggers and keeping a journal and really helping understand where some of those sources are that are really, really important. And no one knows your child or your class like you do. You spend a lot of time with them. And so any information that you can gather to help that child deal with that stress or uncover some of those underlying sources will really impact them for their life. So, that's just kind of my hope and mission, and hope that I get to continue to do more of this because it's really important. And I really feel like there's a need out there for us to kind of all come together and understand how all these things work together to make our children be the best they can be. So thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
Thank you. You did an awesome job, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
All right. See ya.
See you. Thank you. I will also be putting the certificate in the chat box right now. The Google site and Kristie's email address are all on there.